Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for your service. Dr. Hill, I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney's role in the events under investigation. You testified, ma'am, that Mr. Mulvaney and Ambassador Sondland were both involved with a letter President Trump sent to the Ukrainian president on May 29th, congratulating him on his inauguration. Do you recall that, ma'am?
I did, yes.
And towards the end of that letter, President Trump closed with, quote, "I would like to invite you to meet me at the White House in Washington, D.C. as soon as we can find a mutually convenient time," end quote. Dr. Hill, was this congratulatory letter drafted through the normal procedures at the NSC that the NSC uses to send letters to foreign heads of state?
The first part of it was, except the last paragraph.
You also testified that Ambassador Sondland told you that he had dictated that line to the president, and that he told Mr. Mulvaney to add that to the letter. Is that correct, ma'am?
That's correct.
You said that you were nervous about that. Why were you nervous, Dr. Hill?
Because at this juncture, it had become quite apparent that the president wasn't very keen on having a meeting with Mr. Zelensky for all the reasons that we've been trying to lay out today. And we were, once one puts in a letter like that, you raise the expectation of an invitation coming shortly.
Dr. Hill, you also testified, ma'am, that Ambassador Sondland was frequently meeting with Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Giuliani's campaign of lies ultimately led to Ambassador Yovanovitch being recalled from her post in April 2019. You've also testified, ma'am, that her removal was pretty dispiriting and a turning point for you. Can you explain to us why, ma'am?
Well, again, as we've all made clear, Ambassador Yovanovitch, and you saw for yourselves in her deposition, is a person of great integrity. She's one of our finest foreign service officers, career foreign service officers. And if there'd been a decision to remove her, to replace her with a political appointee, again, that is perfectly within the rights of the president. Sometimes it's highly advisable, in fact, to emphasize to a country just exactly how close the relationship is likely to be, to have an appointee who is close to the president if it's an important relationship. But what was dispiriting was all of the accusations that were being fired at Ambassador Yovanovitch, leading her to be tweeted, including by members of the president's family. We all firmly believe that Mr. Giuliani and others, including the people who were recently indicted, the Ukrainian American gentleman, had for some reason decided that Ambassador Yovanovitch was some kind of personal problem for them. And that they had then decided to engage in just the kinds of things we've been discussing about. And frankly, she was an easy target as a woman. And I'm very sorry to hear about what's happened to Congressman Stefanik. And I think that this just illustrates the point and the problem that we're dealing with here today.
Certainly. I was also struck by your testimony that you were also the target of false accusations during your time in the Trump administration. You testified, ma'am, about receiving hateful calls and being accused of being, quote, a mole in the White House. You testified about death threats and calls at your home. Is that right?
That's correct. That was in 2017.
Well, I'm sorry you've had to go through all of this, ma'am. You don't strike me as a woman who is easily deterred. You're not easily deterred, are you, Dr. Hill?
I'm not, no.
Thank you both for your service. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just another fact check, and again, my caution to both of you that representations about what prior witnesses said or what you have even said may not be consistent with the facts. This was from Ambassador Sondland's opening statement. After the Zelensky meeting, I also met with Zelensky's senior aide, Andrei Yermak. I don't recall the specifics of our conversation, but I believe the issue of investigations was probably a part of that agenda or meeting. Now recognize Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. You know, in 1998, I voluntarily joined the United States Army Reserve because I saw our country under attack time and time again. Bill Clinton was the president. I didn't vote for Bill Clinton, but he was my commander-in-chief. It didn't matter that I didn't vote for him. I'm grateful to live in a country that gets to legitimately elect our leaders. And I've been to places where people don't get to, and it's not pretty. And I respect our system, and I accept the results that are determined by the American people. I deployed to Iraq 2005-2006 as an Army surgeon with soldiers from many backgrounds. The most important thing was we were all Americans. That was first and foremost. In our mission, we treated our troops, we treated the enemy, winning over the hearts and minds of people that never knew us because of their dictator, Saddam Hussein, who told them that we were responsible for all their problems, and that was his narrative. And speaking of narratives, Dr. Hill, I'm sorry, I have to say this. You said based on statements you've heard that some in this committee believe Russia did not conduct a campaign against our country is false. That's Mr. Schiff's narrative. That's where you've heard it. We did a whole report on it. And we agree that Russia has done this since the Soviet Union, and they've actually gotten better at it. That's a problem. But at the same time, certain Ukrainians did work against candidate Trump, some with the DNC. And if that's debunked, why is it Mr. Schiff has denied DNC operative Alexandra Chalupa from testifying to come forward and debunk it? I ask America, was it good for the country for the DNC and the Clinton campaign to pay Christopher Steele to dig up fake dirt with other foreign service sources on their political rival? Was it good for America to claim having evidence of the president colluding with Russians when he did not, costing the taxpayer millions and being debunked by special counsel? I'd say the false narrative got caught. Was it good for the country, for Americans and foreigners alike, to attempt to entrap members of a United States presidential campaign, specifically the Trump campaign? Sadly, I've come to believe through all this that some in power do think it's good. They think it's okay. And now we're here in an impeachment proceeding, certainly a right that Congress has, and apparently even with very partisan rules. But I'm curious, this impeachment inquiry was announced by the Speaker before the whistleblower complaint was even out. I'm curious why the lawyer for the whistleblower announced that the coup to impeach the president, that he announced that right after Trump won. That's pretty damning. I know it hurts after losing an election, especially as Americans, we usually get over it. And I imagine it would hurt even more if you were promised a position in the next administration and lost, and your hopes and your dreams are dashed. You know, I've seen hatred for political reasons, specifically on June 14th, 2017 at a ball field in Virginia. And I've seen hatred in war. And I know that hatred blinds people. I've been in war, and I've studied war. And coups create division. And it's time for this phase of the publicly announced and proclaimed Democrat coup to end. Thank you for your service. Thanks for being here, and I yield back.
Could I actually say something? Because we've had three.
Dr. I was going to ask you if you'd like to respond. There have been a number. Gentleman suspended. Dr. Hill, you may respond.
No, I think that what Dr. Wenstrup said was very powerful about the importance of overcoming hatred and certainly partisan division. And it's unfortunate that Congressmen Turner and Ratcliffe have both left as well, because I think all of us who came here under a legal obligation also felt we had a moral obligation to do so. We came as fact witnesses. When I was referring to questions that I'd heard, it was in the context of the deposition that I gave on October 14th, because I was very worried about the turn in which some of the questions were taking. And I understand that the point is being made about individuals, as you've just said, Dr. Wenstrup, and that these articles lay out taking different positions in our elections. I don't believe that there should be any interference of any kind in our election. I think it was unfair for people to already call the election and to make attacks also on candidate Trump and on President Trump. And I know that this has put a huge cloud over this presidency and also over our whole democratic system. That's actually why, as a non-partisan person and as an expert on Russia and an expert on Vladimir Putin and on the Russian security services, I wanted to come in to serve the country to try to see if I could help. I heard President Trump say that he wanted to improve the relations with Russia. I believe we have to. We can't be in this unending confrontation with Russia. We have to find a way to stabilize that relationship and to professionalize that relationship, as well as to stop them from doing what they did in 2016 again in 2020. This is really the crux of the issue that I and others are trying to put across, and I think that you've put across very eloquently. The other matters related to this inquiry, we're here just to provide what we know and what we've heard. I understand that for many members this may be hearsay. I've talked about things I heard with my own ears. I understand that Ambassador Sondland has said a lot of things. I've told you what he told me and what others told me. A lot of other people have said things to me again as well, and also to Mr. Holmes, and we're here to relate to you what we heard, what we saw, and what we did, and to be of some help to all of you in really making a very momentous decision here. We are not the people who make that decision. And I do, again, want to underscore what you said here, Dr. Winstrup. It was very eloquent and very moving about your service and trying to bring us all together again as Americans. We need to be together again in 2020 so the American people can make a choice about the future and about make their vote in a presidential election without any fear that this is being interfered in from any quarter whatsoever. So I just want to thank you for making what I think was also a very elegant and eloquent and heartfelt defense.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Dr. Hill, Mr. Holmes, thank you both for being fact witnesses. We are here as fact finders, and we appreciate very much your presentations. Dr. Hill, I want to verify this story. I understand that when you were 11 years old, there was a schoolboy who set your pigtails on fire, and you were taking a test. You turned around and with your hands snuffed out the fire and then proceeded to finish your test. Is that a true story?
It is a true story. I was a bit surprised to see that pop up today. It's one of the stories I occasionally tell because it had some very unfortunate consequences afterwards. My mother gave me a bowl haircut. So for the school photograph later in that week, I look like Richard III, or as if I'm going to be in a permanent...
Well, I think it underscores the fact that you speak truth, that you are steely, and I truly respect that. Let me move to your testimony in your deposition. You had indicated you were deeply troubled by Ambassador Yovanovitch's the attacks on her, and you underscored again today that all ambassadors serve at the pleasure of the president. And certainly in the case of Ambassador Yovanovitch, he could have just asked her to come home. But that didn't happen. In fact, there was a systematic character assassination that went on. It went on from 2018, if I'm not mistaken. But you say, and the most obvious explanation at this point, it has to be said, seemed to be business dealings of individuals who wanted to improve their investment positions inside of Ukraine itself. You were then asked, who do you understand was responsible for her removal? And you said, I understand this to be the result of the campaign that really Mr. Giuliani had set in motion in conjunction with people who were writing articles and, publications that I would have expected better of. And also, just the constant drumbeat of these accusations that he was making on the television. So, Rudy Giuliani was playing fast and furious in Ukraine, it would appear. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And he had no official tasking within the administration. Is that correct?
Not that I had been told of.
But he frequently met with Ukrainian officials to request that they open an investigation.
So I was led to understand, yes.
You testified that Mr. Giuliani's involvement was, quote, a massive complication in terms of our engagement with Ukraine.
That's correct.
Would you like to explain that?
Well, I think I already laid that out in an earlier part of response to some of the questions. We were actually conducting, which, for a lot of the American people might seem to be a rather boring, standard bilateral policy toward Ukraine. pushing them on issues of reform in the energy sector and more broadly. We were concerned, obviously, about corruption in Ukraine. We were trying to help Ukraine regain its sovereignty after the attacks by Russia.
So how did Mr. Giuliani's involvement affect you?
Well, we basically had worked out over a course of 2 years and in close conjunction with the embassy in Kiev, an interagency agreed action plan. And these are things that, in fact, Colonel Vindman and others were working on, basically moving forward on the various issues that were on the list of items. Clearly, Rudy Giuliani and other people didn't care at all about this.
All right.
Frankly, Ambassador Sondland wasn't particularly interested in it either. It's quite boring. It wouldn't make for good copy in the press. And it's the kind of thing that everybody in a routine moves forward on.
Mr. Holmes, you talked about the extraordinary power that Russia tries to assert against Ukraine. So since President Zelensky never got his White House meeting, doesn't that make Ukraine look weak, and doesn't that benefit Russia?
Absolutely, it does.
So promoting Putin's false claim of Ukraine intervention into the U.S. election also benefits Russia, doesn't it?
It does.
So when President Trump meets privately with Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit, who does that benefit?
Well, it doesn't help Ukraine.
It doesn't help Ukraine. And by President Trump calling Ukraine corrupt and not North Korea, for instance, does that accrue to Russia's benefit?
Again, it doesn't help Ukraine.
All right. I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the rest of my time to you.
You're yielding me 3 seconds. Not even I can make use of 3 seconds. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. Dr. Hill, Ms. Holmes, thank you for being here. I actually have no questions for you that haven't already been asked or made any points that haven't already been made. And I guess I'll just conclude by something I've said before. This Impeach-a-Palooza tour finally comes to an end. I mean, a year of resistance, 2.5 years of these absurd accusations against the president of Russian collusion. We've gone from quid pro quo to bribery to extortion, 7 weeks of hearings, 16 secret closed-door sessions, 12 public hearings, now of which you are the last, hundreds of hours of testimony. And I really think that for those who hate the president, they haven't changed their minds. But there's a lot of Americans who look at this and they think, is that it, really? You're going to impeach and remove a president for this? Now, like I said, if you don't like the president, you've already come to that conclusion. Many people wanted this 3 years ago. But for a lot of Americans, they really look at that, and they can see this. No evidence, zero evidence of any bribery, zero evidence of extortion, zero evidence firsthand of any quid pro quo. And yet, impeachment is almost inevitable. And why? Because the leadership of this committee has been unfair and dishonest. And I know we hear these crocodile tears from some of my colleagues who are heartbroken because they finally have to impeach this president. And we know that's absurd. There's no heartbroken. There's no prayerful tears over this. They're giddy over this. And there's not a person in the country who doesn't know that. Everyone knows what they're going to do next. They're going to impeach the president and they're going to send it on to the Senate. But that is the good news. That's good news. You know, we've all been to a concert. You got the warm-up band, and then you got the main act. And what we've seen here is the warm-up band. This is kind of like the Sioux City Crooners. This is a band that no one's ever heard of. But the warm-up band is over, and now we're going to go on to the main event, and that's in the U.S. Senate. And in the U.S. Senate, there won't be any secret testimony. There's not going to be dishonest leadership or a chairman who refuses to let us ask appropriate questions or to deny a defense. Where in the world, where in the country do you have a trial where the prosecution presents their case and the defense isn't able to? So we'll finally be able to get to the truth. And so I'm talking now to my colleagues in the Senate. These are some of the witnesses that you need to call, and these are some of the questions that you need to ask. First, you have to hear from the whistleblower. Now, they can choose to do that in closed session if they want to. I leave that up to them. But you can't initiate an impeachment of the President of the United States and not have to answer some questions. Who did he get his information from? Did he have the classification and the clearances to get that information? What's his relationship with Vice President Biden? Who has he shared that information with, including some members of the committee here? I think our own chairman needs to be called. What interactions did he or his staff have with the whistleblower? Did they help to coordinate or in any way facilitate the complaint? Did they coordinate and facilitate him counsel? What about Hunter Biden? How did he get his job? What did he do to earn his salary? And here's the key to this. Look, if he goes there and makes money, knock yourself out. I don't care. But I want to know, did he have officials with, or conversations with government officials, and was government policy changed at a particularly high level because of some of those? Devin Archer, former board member from Brisbane. Alexandria Chalupa, former DNC official who admitted she provided anti-Trump information to the DNC and to Hillary Clinton. Nellie Orr from Fusion GPS, who helped to create the ridiculous Steele dossier. I'd like to remind us what I said yesterday. The American people expect a lot in politics. They understand the tussle, the fight, the debate, but they also expect basic fairness. And these proceedings have been anything but fair. The Senate has an opportunity to fix that. I am confident they will, and I look forward to them completing the job that we could have done here. And with that, I will yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Dr. Hill, when we last left July 10th, I believe Ambassador Bolton said to you, you go and tell Dr. Eisenberg that I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this, and you go tell him what you heard and what I've said. That's correct, is that right?
That's correct, sir, yes.
And John Eisenberg, he's the chief lawyer for the National Security Council, correct?
He is, yes.
And you went to see him?
I did go to see him.
And what did you say to him that day?
I basically gave him the same summary that I've given to you on the 10th of July.
What took place?
Of what took place, correct, including some of the details that I shared with you as well, the sequencing and what transpired as I was walking in.
Now, did you have one or two meetings with him about that?
He did not have a great deal of time on the 10th, and I gave him the quick summary, and we agreed that we would meet again on the 11th, on July 11th, the next day. And I also wanted to bring in with me my colleague, Wells Griffith, our Senior Director for Energy, who'd been sitting with me on the sofa for the first portion of the meeting. And I also suggested that he speak to Colonel Vindman separately as well, because Colonel Vindman was in the wardroom when I arrived and had obviously been engaged in some discussion before I got there, because as I got into the room, they were clearly in the course of, sorry, with the microphone, clearly in the course of conversation. And I thought it was important for John Eisenberg to hear from Colonel Vindman himself what his recollections of the meeting were.
Did you raise the concerns that Ambassador Bolton had raised to you, to Mr. Eisenberg?
I certainly did. The first thing I related to him was exactly and precisely what Ambassador Bolton had asked me to. In the course of those two meetings, what was Mr. Eisenberg's response? Mr. Eisenberg took it all very seriously. He said, for example, that Colonel Vindman should feel free, he said this to me, in future to go and bring any concerns to him about these meetings. Similarly, myself and any others, if there was any subsequent follow-up in terms of these issues being raised again with any of the parties in the future. He didn't say anything in response about how he took that meeting, how he would describe it, or if he had any, did he raise any concerns about what you told him that took place? No, he did not. He listened very carefully to all of the information that we imparted. Now, back to that July 10th meeting, the second meeting that's in the wardroom, correct? That's correct. Now, who's in that meeting besides yourself, the two Ukrainians? Mr. Danilyuk, Mr. Yermak's aide, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, and then a couple of people who I think were from the State Department. I wondered for a while if one of Secretary Perry's group had been there too. But I honestly cannot remember. But Ambassador Volker was there during that entire. He was there, but he didn't actually speak very much during that meeting. And I heard his deposition, and I read his deposition where he didn't really recall that encounter. Again, he didn't really speak. Ambassador Sondland was doing most of the speaking. Yeah, and I think you described it as you came in
Ambassador Sondland was talking about how he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mulvaney for a meeting with the Ukrainians if they were going forward with the investigations. While this was taking place and afterwards, how were the Ukrainians reacting to what was being said?
Well, at the time, Mr. Yermak was quite impassive. I said that he had an aide with him, and his aide was sitting next to him in the original meeting with Ambassador Bolton and was, from time to time, actually was on this side, whispering to him. So I wasn't sure myself, because I had not met Mr. Yermak before, about how good his English was. So I wasn't sure, perhaps Mr. Holmes might be able to reflect on that, as to whether he was, having some points of clarification from the aide.
He understood what was happening.
Yeah, so I wasn't entirely sure if he was following all of the back and forth. Mr. Daniluk, who I know very well and speaks very good English, looked quite alarmed. I think he was more alarmed at the fact that there was this back and forth between Ambassador Sondland and Colonel Vindman, then with me, about the meeting. Clearly, they very much wanted to have this meeting, and here are some US officials arguing about the meeting in front of him, and that was obviously very uncomfortable for him.
Did you have any follow-up to that, sir?
Just to add that Daniluk speaks perfect English, and Yermak can get by in meetings, but often does ask for clarifications.
Given the time, I would yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Before I turn to our witnesses, I just wanted to say to my Democratic colleagues, not a single Republican member of this committee has said that Russia did not meddle in the 2016 elections. As the ranking member stated, we published a report focused on Russian active measures in 2016 with policy recommendations as to how we strengthen our cyber resiliency and election security to counter Russia. I myself have worked with members of this very committee on this issue, but also on the House Armed Services Committee. So to have our Democratic colleagues say these untruthful statements just reeks of political desperation in their continued obsession to manipulate mainstream media coverage. But the good news is the American people understand that this has been a partisan process from the start. The Democratic coordination with the whistleblower, the incessant and astounding leaks, the unprecedented closed-door process, closed to the majority of members, closed to the press, closed to the people, starting this inquiry without taking a vote. And then when finally forced to take a vote, the vote was with bipartisan opposition. Now, with 4 minutes left, I'm going to turn to our two witnesses. Thank you both for your service. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for your comments on the personal attacks. I wanted to ask you each fact-based questions. Dr. Hill, you testified that you handed over your duties on the NSC to Tim Morrison on July 15th and that you physically left the White House on July 19th, correct?
That is correct, yes.
So that means that by the time there was the July 25th call with President Trump and President Zelensky, you were no longer on the NSC, correct?
Actually, I was still technically on the payroll of the NSC until the end of August 30th of 2019, but I was not physically in the building, and I'd handed over my duties to Mr. Morrison.
And you were not on the call?
I was not on the call. That is absolutely correct.
And it's also correct that you did not participate in the preparation of talking points or the specific coordination of setting up the call?
Not for that call, but let me just say for the record that there had been a long anticipation that eventually there would be a call. So there was a call package that was prepared in advance. I just cannot say how much of that call package that had perhaps been prepared since, for example, the inauguration of President Zelensky was then used as the basic material for that call. So I did take part in the preparation of that standard call package, but I did not take part in any preparation for the specific call on July 25th.
And the first time you actually read the transcript of the call was when it was released to the public?
That's correct.
Mr. Holmes, I wanted to turn to you. Good to see you again. Thank you for mentioning the bipartisan delegation that I led on behalf of the House Armed Services Committee with my friend, Representative Anthony Brown from Maryland. We did have an exceptionally informative visit where we highlighted the bipartisan congressional support for Ukraine, in particular the importance of countering Russian aggression. And we discussed in the briefings at the embassy the importance of defensive lethal aid in the form of javelins, which, as you both, I think you stated today, is, quote, an important strategic deterrent to Russia. And I just want to highlight on the record, I know this has been asked, the javelins were provided by the Trump administration and not the Obama administration, correct?
That's correct. And I would just say, I think we discussed the importance of all our security assistance to Ukraine, not just the javelins.
Absolutely, all of our security assistance, which I strongly support. Again, thank you for being a host on that. Dr. Hill, turning back to you, there's been discussion about the process of scheduling the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump. And you testified that there was hesitancy to schedule this meeting until after the Ukrainian parliamentary elections. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that's because there was speculation in all analytical circles, both in Ukraine and outside the Ukraine, that Zelensky might not be able to get the majority that he needed to form a cabinet, correct?
That is correct.
And you also testified that another aspect of the NSC's hesitancy to schedule this meeting was based on broader concerns related to Zelensky's ability to implement anti-corruption reforms. And this was in specific relation to Ukrainian oligarchs who basically were the owner of the TV company that Mr. Zelensky's program had been a part of. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Just distilling this down to the key facts, I wanted to ask both of you three key questions. So the fact of the matter is Ukraine ultimately did receive the aid, correct, Mr. Holmes?
Ultimately.
Yes. And Dr. Hill?
Correct, ultimately.
And there was no investigation into the Bidens, correct, Mr. Holmes?
They did not open a new investigation into the Bidens. No.
Correct. And Dr. Hill?
Correct.
And there was, in fact, a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky ultimately at the UN. Is that correct?
The president invited Zelensky to the Oval Office at a date undetermined. That has not yet happened.
The meeting at the UN. President Trump and President Zelensky met at the UN.
They did, but not in the Oval Office.
But they did have a meeting at the UN.
They did, ma'am.
And Dr. Hill, they did? Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Swalwell.
Dr. Hill, yesterday I think a lot of Americans were scratching their heads as Ambassador Sondland testified that on September 9 he calls the President of the United States and just says broadly, "What do you want from Ukraine?" And the President says, "There's no quid pro quo. There's no quid pro quo." It's like being pulled over for speeding and being asked, "Do you know how fast you're going?" and saying, "I didn't rob the bank. I didn't rob the bank." But your testimony today is that on July 10 of this year, you told one of the president's lawyers that you had concerns that a White House meeting was linked to investigations. Is that right?
That's correct, based on what Ambassador Sondland said in the wardroom.
And so as early as July 10, the president's lawyers had knowledge that there was at least concern by a presidential employee about a linkage. Is that right?
That's correct.
Dr. Hill, just like you, we are trying to account for all the president's men. You had that same concern when you saw Mr. Sondland's emails and you saw people who were outside the channels that you had been working on. So I want to walk you through something you told us earlier. You said that you have evidence that as recently as this year, President Trump believes someone named Cash was the Ukraine director. Is that right?
It's not really evidence. And look, I want to be very clear about this. I was asked a question about this in my deposition. I did not raise it. And to be honest, I was surprised that I was asked the question.
But you heard that name Cash. Is that right?
I did, but again, it was in passing, and I explained the circumstances in which this came up. But I was asked a question in the course of my deposition about it.
And the only person at the time who worked at the National Security Council was Kash Patel. Is that right?
It was the only person that I could think of.
And Kash Patel, prior to working for the National Security Council from 2017 to 2018, worked for Ranking Member Nunes. Is that right?
I actually only found that out after the fact.
And
because I wondered why I was being asked about him, so I went and looked this up.
And Dr. Hill, you cautioned us on the dangers of members of this committee, perhaps peddling any Ukrainian conspiracy theories that could benefit Russia. And I want to ask you if you have heard the name Lev Parnas of Ukraine, someone in this investigation who was influencing President Trump and Rudy Giuliani about some of the debunked conspiracy theories you referenced earlier.
I have heard his name, yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Parnas was indicted on October 10 for making foreign contributions to Republicans in U.S. elections?
I am aware of those reports, yes.
Are you aware of yesterday's Daily Beast story reporting the indicted Ukrainian Lev Parnas has been working with Ranking Member Devin Nunes on Mr. Nunes's overseas investigations?
I am not aware of that.
Mr. Chairman, I asked unanimous consent to put into the record the Daily Beast story. Lev Parnas helped Rep. Devin Nunes's investigations from yesterday. First two paragraphs reading, Lev Parnas, an indicted associate of Rudy Giuliani, helped arrange meetings and calls in Europe for Rep. Devin Nunes in 2018, Parnas' lawyer Ed McMahon told the Daily Beast. Nunes' aide Derek Harvey participated in the meetings, the lawyer said, which were arranged to help Nunes' investigative work. McMahon didn't specify what those investigations entailed.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, you have been falsely accused throughout these proceedings by the ranking member as being a quote-unquote fact witness. Now, if this story is correct, the ranking member may have actually been projecting. And in fact, he may be the fact witness if he is working with indicted individuals around our investigation. But I want to go to what this is really all about. First, it's your credibility, Mr. Holmes. And can you tell us and confirm that in 2014 you received the William Rivkin Constructive Dissent Award from the Obama administration State Department?
Yes, sir.
And that was for dissent that you brought up against an administration policy, is that right?
That's right.
Congratulations, and thank you for speaking up in the way that you did. But what we're really here about is what you're working on in Ukraine. And I want you to take a look at the picture. Who do you see in the foreground of that photo?
President Zelensky.
That's a photograph in May 2019 where newly elected President Zelensky visited the Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine. It was his first visit to the front lines of Donbass as president. Can you just tell tax-paying Americans why it's so important that our hard-earned tax-paying dollars help President Zelensky and the men standing beside him fight against Russia in this hot war?
Absolutely, sir. President Zelensky was elected on an overwhelming majority to defend Ukrainian interests. This is at a time when Ukrainians are defending their sovereignty, their territorial integrity on Ukrainian soil from Russian-backed soldiers who are attacking them. As I said, 14,000 Ukrainian lives lost in this war so far. As I mentioned, a few this week already. And this is a hot war. This is not a frozen conflict. People are shooting at each other and dying, being injured every single week. And despite the ongoing war, they're still trying to pursue peace. President Zelensky, even right now, is trying to pursue a summit meeting with President Putin in order to try to bring this war to a conclusion so that they can move on with all of the difficult things they need to do in terms of building the economy and reforming the judiciary and whatnot. And I want to add just one other thing, sir, if I may. Mr. Turner had suggested earlier that I'd somehow embarrassed President Zelensky. I have the deepest respect for President Zelensky. This is a guy of Jewish background from a post-Soviet industrial suburb in southern Ukraine who made himself one of the most popular entertainers in the country and somehow got elected president, and he's not going to miss that opportunity. This is a Ukrainian patriot. This is a tough guy, and frankly, he withstood a lot of pressure for a very long time. And he didn't give that interview. I have the deepest respect for him. The Ukrainian people also have the deepest respect for him. They've chosen him to help deliver the full measure of promise of their revolution of dignity, and I think he merits all of our respect.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the May 27 photograph depicted on the screen into the record.
Without objection, Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Mr. Holmes, for your years of service to this country, and I appreciate y'all being here today. Throughout this process, I have said that I want to learn the facts so we can get to the truth. So why are we here? Because of two things that occurred during the President's July 25th phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky. The use of the phrase, "do us a favor," though, in reference to the 2016 presidential election, and the mention of the word Biden. I believe both statements were inappropriate, misguided foreign policy, and it's certainly not how the executive, current or in the future, should handle such a call. Over the course of these hearings, the American people have learned about a series of events that, in my view, have undermined our national security and undercut Ukraine, a key partner on the front lines against Russian aggression. We've heard of U.S. officials carrying uncoordinated, confusing, and conflicting messages that created doubt and uncertainty in Kyiv at a time when a new reformist administration has just taken office and was ready to fight corruption and work with us to advance other U.S. objectives. I disagree with this sort of bungling foreign policy. But through these hearings, many of my colleagues have unwittingly undermined the Ukrainian government by suggesting that it is subservient to the United States, and without the United States, they wouldn't be able to function. The Ukrainians, as you stated, Mr. Holmes, is in a hot war with Russia, and they are holding their own. We could benefit from the experience of the Ukrainians, not the other way around. While I thought the Intelligence Committee would actually be engaged in oversight of the intelligence and national security communities, unfortunately, we are not. We're here talking about one of the most serious constitutional duties we have as members of Congress, the impeachment and removal of the President of the United States. Over the past weeks, we've learned a few things. The officials on the July 25th call have many different opinions on whether the call was concerning or not, and just because Vice President Biden is running for president does not mean that corruption related to Burisma, Ukraine's largest natural gas company, and Americans' ties to it are not concerning. There's also a lot we do not know. We have not heard from Rudy Giuliani. We haven't heard from Hunter Biden. I'd like to know more about both of their activities, why they talk to whom and to whom. Despite promises from Chairman Schiff, we have also not heard from the whistleblower, something that can occur in a closed setting without violating his or her anonymity. We need to understand the motivations and level of coordination that happened prior to his or her submission of the complaint. Over the past few weeks, and even today, it's been reiterated. In 2017, the Trump administration made the decision to provide lethal defensive aid to Ukraine after the Obama administration refused to do so. Ukraine is receiving all the security assistance as directed by Congress. President Zelensky has undertaken significant anti-corruption efforts, including eliminating the parliamentary immunity from prosecution. And, again, Mr. Holmes, you mentioned this today, under President Zelensky's leadership, we have finally seen some progress this fall towards ending the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. So where does this leave us? An impeachable offense should be compelling, overwhelmingly clear, and unambiguous, and it's not something to be rushed or taken lightly. I've not heard evidence proving the president committed bribery or extortion. I also reject the notion that holding this view means supporting all the foreign policy choices we have been hearing about over these last few weeks. To paraphrase Tim Morrison's testimony this week, every day the national conversation on Ukraine is focused on impeachment, not the conflict in the Donbass, not the illegal occupation of Crimea, not the need for reforms in Ukraine's government economy. It's a day where we are not focused on our shared national security interests with Kyiv. I hope that we won't let this very partisan process keep us from agreeing on how a free and prosperous Ukraine is important to the security of the Ukrainian people, the United States of America, and the rest of the world. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back my time, I'd like to make a statement for the record that has this committee been given proper notice as required by House Rule 11, Clause 2G3, that a business meeting was to follow last night's hearing, and had Mr. Conaway's point of order been appropriately recognized, I would have voted no on the committee's first motion to table during last night's impromptu meeting, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, both of you, for your testimony today. I first want to say, because I think it shouldn't go unmentioned, that the characterization just a few minutes ago by one of my Republican colleagues of this proceeding, I think, was vile, irresponsible, and dangerous. And I want to remind us why we're here. Because somebody in government, a whistleblower, felt that it was important enough to get other people in government's attention that the president may have committed a wrong act. We have now heard and seen substantial evidence that the president, in fact, tried to trade a political favor for official government resources. The most damning words come from no one else but the president himself on that phone call with the Ukrainian president, where he asked for a favor. He mentions investigations, he mentions the Bidens and Burisma. However, as Mr. Holmes has testified, Mr. Holmes also overheard the president speaking to his hand-picked ambassador, Ambassador Sondland, about investigations. Mr. Holmes has also said that in the office, everybody knew, or many people knew at least, that there was the president wanted an investigation of the Bidens. In addition, although Mick Mulvaney and Rudy Giuliani have not come before this committee, Mick Mulvaney and Rudy Giuliani have spoken publicly on the issue of investigations. Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff, the person who usually works with the president the most day in and day out, went in front of the White House press corps and basically admitted that an investigation had something to do with holding up the aid. and admitted that this process was politicized. Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, also essentially admitted that these investigations were at issue. He said that he thinks he did nothing wrong because he was working at the direction of the president. So we have seen substantial evidence and heard substantial evidence of wrongdoing by the President of the United States. And this Congress will have to continue to take up this very important issue to the American people. My concern today is also, I feel as though the cancer of wrongdoing may have spread beyond the President and into others of the executive branch. And I want to ask you a few questions about that. Before I do, I'd like, Chairman, to enter 2 articles into the record, if I could. One of them is headlined, "After Boost from Perry, Backers Got Huge Gas Deal in Ukraine." The other one is titled, "Wall Street Journal, Federal Prosecutors Probe Giuliani's Links to Ukrainian Energy Projects." Mr. Holmes, thank you, Chairman. You indicated that Secretary Perry, when he was in the Ukraine, had private meetings with Ukrainians. Before he had those private meetings, in a meeting with others, including yourself, I believe, he had presented a list of American advisors for the Ukraine energy sector. Do you know who was on that list?
Sir, I didn't see the names on the list myself.
Do you know if Alex Cranberg and Michael Blazer were on that list?
I have since heard that Michael Blazer's on the list.
Before Secretary Perry did this, we also heard in testimony before that Ambassador Sondland also had a private meeting with somebody. How unusual was it before these guys showed up for folks, diplomats, so to speak, or U.S. government officials, to have private meetings where they insist that nobody else be in the room?
Very rare, almost never.
Okay. And I want to ask you also about the precedent that we set, both of you. I know you're here as fact witnesses, but you're also public servants for this country. The precedent that this Congress would set, putting aside Donald Trump for a second, if the Congress allows a president of the United States, now or later, to ask a foreign government, head of state, to investigate a political rival, what precedent does that set for American diplomacy, for the safety of Americans overseas, and for the future of our country?
It's a very bad precedent.
Very bad precedent, and going forward, if that were ever the case, I would raise objections.
Thank you both. I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank you, Chair. I want to return the favor and recognize my colleague, yield to my colleague, Congressman Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hill, I don't think there's a lot of questions that one of Putin's primary objectives within the United States is to foment unrest within our nation, to cause us to have lose confidence in our elections, the results of the elections, those kind of things. There is tension, though, in conducting our businesses the way we should, and playing into Putin's hands. As an example, while I disagree with what we're doing here today, it's under our Constitution, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe that they are functioning under that Constitution. These hearings, this issue is very divisive within our country, and is continuing to push that way. I think that plays into Putin's hands inadvertently. Maybe nothing we can do about that. But there are certain things we can do as individuals that wouldn't play into his hands, and one of them would be that the loser in the 2016 election has for 3 years continued to argue that because she won the popular vote, as she and her friends won the popular vote, that somehow the election was inappropriate and that we shouldn't trust it, that the Electoral College victory, which was resounding, shouldn't be trusted. Does that help Putin or play into the narrative that he would like for us to do, that our elections are somehow rigged and shouldn't be trusted?
Yes, it does.
So the RT, Putin's, would you agree with me that RT is Putin's propaganda machine here in the United States?
I would agree with you, yes.
So is it appropriate for the RT to be used to affect public policy on our nation? As an example, there have been a long series of advertisements or programs on RT going against fracking that are saying that's bad and trying to affect public policy in the United States. Is that appropriate use, or is that should Americans be paying attention to that?
In the sense that Americans should be paying attention that RT and other outlets are used to propagate this kind of information, absolutely. I wasn't quite sure what you meant about should
just
be paying attention.
Fracking is a controversial issue within our nation. If we did away with fracking, the United States would not be in a position today to dominate the oil production within the world and would play into strengthening Putin's hands with respect to
That's correct. And actually, I'd like to point out that in 2011, in November 2011, I actually sat next to Vladimir Putin at a conference in which he made precisely that point. It was the first time that he had actually done so to a group of American journalists and experts who were brought to something called the Valdai Discussion Club. So he started in 2011 making it very clear that he saw American fracking as a great threat to Russian interests. We were all struck by how much he stressed this issue, and it's since 2011 and since that particular juncture that Putin has made a big deal of this.
So the extent that Americans pay attention to RT and are misguided by whatever propaganda he's going, it's not in our nation's best interest. Mr. Holmes, in your role, you're privileged to an awful lot of stuff, official things and things that are best kept between you and the official folks that you deal with. Is there an expectation among the principles that you represent that you will exercise some discretion in what you share with others about what goes on?
Yes, sir.
In your testimony, in your deposition, you made well, first off, we had a hard time pinning down the number of people that you've actually had this conversation with about the conversation that you overheard. Now, our ambassador had no expectation of privacy. He's blustering around and doing what he's done, but we couldn't figure out how many people you actually shared that information with. And I would argue that the information is unflattering to the president, unflattering to the ambassador, and that your discretion is at odds here. I mean, your testimony, your deposition said you shared that with folks who you thought would find it interesting. Well, I'd argue that everybody on the back row would find it interesting, but I don't know that that's necessarily a criterion. So on a go-forward basis, can you articulate that in the future, when you're privileged to certain circumstances that would be embarrassing to the principal, that if it's official that you share with the ambassador, that's fine, but the folks outside the embassy or folks even within the embassy that don't have a need to know, that you wouldn't regale them with your recounting of those instances?
Sir, I think it was Gordon Sondland who showed indiscretion by having that conversation over.
No. You're well.
That's the first. Second thing is,
excuse me, Mr. Holmes. Let me clarify the question.
Mr. Holmes,
the question wasn't. Excuse me, Mr.
Let him answer your question, sir.
It's my question. You're exactly right, and I get to clarify my question to get the answer. And I'm hopeful I get in a few more seconds because of the interruption from the chairman. His patience is growing thin. I was working hard not to irritate him again, but I failed again. The question is of you, Mr. Holmes. Your discretion. Gordon Sondland did not expect privacy. I got that. But you're going to be in rooms you've been in rooms 17 years where people trust that when whatever went on in that room and left, that you kept it to official channels, that you didn't share all that information with other folks. And I'm just asking you to argue on your own behalf that interesting is not some sort of a criterion that you would use when you share information from meetings. Simple, straightforward question.
Sir, I shared the information that I needed to share with the right people who needed to know it. I did not share any information that people didn't need to know.
But you did use the word interesting,
Mr. Conway. Your time is expired.
It certainly was interesting, sir. And I would also hate to think that what I brought before this process, I shouldn't have done that. I've come here because you've subpoenaed me to share what I know, and I've done that.
As long as you were cut off when you were talking about Mr. Sondland's indiscretion, did you want to finish that answer?
I think,
Mr. Chairman, that's patently unfair.
Ms. Conway,
you've run this entire investigation.
It's unfair, Ms. Conway, to interrupt the witnesses as you have done repeatedly.
Well, but you're certainly willing to interrupt me during my 5 minutes. You're the only person on this dais that has unlimited time. You have absolutely unlimited time. You're the only one that has abused that power, and you're continuing to do that.
The gentleman will cease. We allow the witnesses to answer the question, even if those asking the question don't want to hear the answer. Mr. Heck, you are
Does that apply to you as well?
Mr. Holmes, much has been made about the use of both regular and irregular
foreign service or diplomatic channels. My reading of history is that American presidents have on occasion used irregular channels. Would you generally agree?
Yes, sir.
And my reading of history is that, generally speaking, however, those irregular channels have either been closely coordinated with the regular ones or at least in furtherance of American foreign policy and our national security interest. Would you agree?
That's right, sir.
And do you believe, sir, that Mr. Giuliani's efforts were closely coordinated with the regular channels, such as the ambassador to the Ukraine?
No, they weren't.
And were they in furtherance of the American foreign policy as you understood it?
No, sir.
Mr. Holmes, if left unchecked, do you think that Russia would either by means of force or other malign means subjugate Ukraine, attempt to render it a client state, if not occupy it?
Absolutely, sir. It's been said that without Ukraine, Russia's just a country, but with it, it's an empire.
You know, I feel like I've been treated to a Gatling gun fire of myth propagation over the last couple of weeks, and it reminds me of that old expression about the big lie. If you tell it often enough and keep repeating it, that people will come to believe it. And I think we've been subjected to some of that. Here's a sample. The president didn't solicit campaign assistance from Ukraine in a clear violation of federal law. Yes, he did. The president didn't withhold vital military assistance in furtherance of his objective to obtain that campaign assistance. Yes, he did. Rudy Giuliani was acting just on his own, kind of as a rogue. No, he wasn't. That all this is business as usual. This happens all the time and stems from a principled interest. No, it isn't, and no, it wasn't. And that it's okay to attack patriotic diplomats in public service if they stand in your way and have the courage to speak up. And no, it isn't. Those are just some of the big lies. But here's the big truth. The president did it. He did it. We all just came from the floor. And it's a majestic chamber. And in the front of the chamber, there are only two portraits. On the left, looking forward, is my favorite president, George Washington. And on the right is the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to this country to help us stand up our fledgling democracy. So here's another big truth. Without his help, we probably never would have gotten off the ground. And that assistance from many other countries who are helping us to create something that had never been created before. It was an audacious idea. This notion of a democracy, of self-governance, of freedoms such as speech and press and religion and expression and assembly, and most of all, that it would be rooted in the premise of the rule of law. Not monarchs, not military strongmen, but the rule of law. Others helped us to get here, and we wouldn't be here without them. And I frankly feel like we're almost in a little bit of a pay it forward moment. So when the president did it, he put at risk the security of Ukraine, a strategic ally and a nascent democracy with their masses yearning to breathe free, who 6 years ago this day, when their government said we're not going to sign that memorandum of agreement with the European Union, rose up and took to the streets because they wanted, frankly, what we have. And when the president did it, he put our own national security at risk. But what he did, most importantly, was put at risk that idea that makes us exceptional. Because I do believe America is truly exceptional. We are a country rooted in something that nobody has ever tried before, rule of law. He put that at risk when he did what he did. The president did it. And the only question that remains is, what will we do? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hill, during your deposition, I asked you, was Christopher Steele's dossier a rabbit hole? Do you remember the answer you gave to that
Yes,
question?
I thought it was a rabbit hole.
Yeah, and you also said a couple pages later in the deposition, or in the transcript that I have here of your deposition, that you thought he got played. Is that fair?
That is fair, yes.
I was struck by a number of things you said in your statement, a number of things I thought were right on the target, and one was on page 7. You said this: President Putin and the Russian security services weaponize our own political opposition research. And that is exactly what happened in 2016. Exactly what happened. You called it, you knew it, you saw it. The DNC hired Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Christopher Steele, who talked to Russians, who gave him a bunch of dirt, bunch of National Enquirer garbage that he compiled in a dossier, and our FBI used it. They used it as part of their investigation that they opened in July of 2016, where they spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign. My guess is that's probably never happened in American history, and exactly what Dr. Hill talked about is what happened in 2016. Exactly what she talked about. And for 10 months, Jim Comey and his team did an investigation. And after 10 months, they had nothing. Because we deposed Mr. Comey, and he told us after 10 months we didn't have a thing. But that didn't matter. That didn't matter. We got the Mueller investigation. $32 million, 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, 500 search warrants, 2,800 subpoenas, and they came back this spring, and what'd they tell us? No collusion, no conspiracy, no coordination. But the guys on the other side don't care. They don't care. They're doing what Dr. Hill said a number of important things in her opening statement. They're doing exactly what Dr. Hill talked about. The impact of a successful 2016 Russian campaign remains evident today. Our nation is being torn apart. Torn apart. I've never seen it this divided. And it is not healthy. It is not healthy for our culture, our country, not healthy for our nation, but that's what these guys are doing. No conspiracy, no coordination, no collusion, but they don't care. Now this whole impeachment thing, as the witness said yesterday, without an announcement from Zelensky about an investigation, they weren't going to get a call with the president, they weren't going to get a meeting with the president, they weren't going to get aid from the United States. But guess what? Ukraine, they got the call, they got the meeting, and they got the money, and there was never an announcement of any type of investigation. But they don't care. They're going to move forward. There's going to be some kind of report. They're going to send I assume, something to the Judiciary Committee, and the process is going to go forward, and there'll be a trial in the Senate, all based on some anonymous whistleblower who came forward with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden. Now all this. This is, Dr. Hill's right. She said it. We got to stop this. But they're not going to. And they're doing it all 11 and a half months before the next election. And I think maybe the most telling thing is what the Speaker of the House said Sunday. Speaker of the House said Sunday. This is scary. Speaker of the House said Sunday. National Sunday morning TV show. She said the president is an imposter. The guy that 63 million people voted for, who won an electoral college landslide, the Speaker of the House of Representatives called the President of the United States an imposter. Sad. It is sad what the country's going through. I wish it would stop, but unfortunately I don't think it is. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Welch. I want to use my time to speak directly to my colleagues and to the American people. Today's witnesses, and the ones we've been privileged to have before the committee over the last 2 weeks, have provided an invaluable service to our country, not just in all your careers, but in having the courage and the patriotism to share your facts with the American people. And you do so at considerable risk to yourselves, but you've clearly stepped forward for the simple fact you believe it's your duty. In all, your testimony reaffirms a very central fact. President Trump conditioned our foreign policy and national security on getting a valuable political benefit from Ukraine. He wanted Ukraine's new president to create ethical questions about Joe Biden by publicly announcing investigations, and to pressure President Zelensky to take that action that would benefit his personal political interest. He withheld vital military aid to Ukraine and refused to meet with President Zelensky in the Oval Office. And as we heard from Mr. Holmes and Dr. Hill today, that meeting was extraordinarily important to Ukraine and extraordinarily important in sending a message to Russia about our unyielding support. The witnesses have made it absolutely clear what the president did. And it's equally clear that President Trump has launched a cover-up and disinformation campaign to hide this abuse of power from the American people. That's why the administration refuses to provide documents to this committee. And it's why the White House has taken the unprecedented position that senior officials could ignore congressional subpoenas and refuse to testify. That's why Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney, Secretary of State Pompeo, and others have not testified. Now the President and even some members of this committee are pretending this is normal. It is not. It must never be. No other president has betrayed his office like this by putting his own small political interest above our national interest and our national security. You know, I asked some of our witnesses what would happen in any American city or town if the mayor stopped funding the police department until the chief of police launched an investigation into the mayor's political rival, or a governor or a member of Congress did that. And the answer was clear. It would be wrong, it would be illegal, and it wouldn't be tolerated. It would violate the most basic trust we have in public officials. If it happened with a military commander, a court-martial would follow. If it happened with a corporation, a CEO would be fired. We all know this kind of conduct is wrong, but the president continues to say it isn't. He says it's perfect, and he'd do it again tomorrow. The same rules apply to mayors, governors, members of Congress, CEOs, and everyone else in America. They apply to the president, too. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you like MSNBC or Fox, I think every American believes in one of our nation's founding principles: no person is above the law, not even the president. On July 24th, Director Mueller testified about Russian state-sponsored systematic interference in our 2016 election. He expressed apprehension this could become the new normal. The day after, on July 25th, President Trump spoke to President Zelensky and asked a favor. That favor was that Ukraine interfere in our 2020 election. If we allow this to stand, to become the new normal, it will be the standard for all future presidents. In good conscience, none of us can do that. This conduct corrupts our democracy. It corrupts how our country conducts foreign policy. It threatens our national security and the security of all Americans. And it is, in my view, a clear betrayal of the President's oath of office. I yield back.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Chairman, two quick housekeeping matters. Ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an ABC News story. This one's for my friend, Mr. Stewart, entitled 70% of Americans say Trump's actions tied to Ukraine were wrong, dated November 18th, 2019.
Without objection.
Also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a New Yorker story entitled The Invention of the Conspiracy Theory on Biden and Ukraine, how a conservative dark money group that targeted Hillary Clinton in 2016 spread the discredited story that may lead to Donald Trump's impeachment. Jane Mayer, October 4th, 2019.
Without objection.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Dr. Hill, first of all, I thought that was some epic mansplaining that you were forced to endure by my colleague, Mr. Turner, and I want you to know some of us think it was inappropriate, but I appreciate your forbearance. Let me ask something. I'm fascinated by this meeting, two meetings really, on July 10th. You have the meeting in Mr. Bolton's office. Sondland says this thing about investigations. Bolton ends the meeting. Photo. There's a follow-on meeting in the wardroom. And you get there a little late, and Vindman is talking to Sondland, and they're already going at it about Sondland's desire to assert that the meeting's going to happen if there's these investigations. That, in sum and substance, what's going on?
That's it, right, yes.
And what I want to understand is this isn't a policy disagreement, right?
No, that's correct.
The source of your concern is not a policy disagreement, and it's not purely a procedural disagreement either, right? About how excuse me.
I'm sorry. Yes, it's not correct.
It's neither policy nor is it procedure that's bothering you, or for that matter, the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, right?
Correct.
I mean, it's not why he sends you down there to see how the meeting's going.
Correct.
And in fact, he instructs you to go to the lawyer. Ever been instructed to go report something to the NSC lawyer before?
That was the first time. I've self-instructed a couple of times, but that was the first time I have been instructed to go.
And why did he send you to report this to the lawyer?
Well, he clearly wanted to have himself on the record as not being part of what was basically an agreement to have a meeting in return for investigations. And he wanted to make sure that I and Colonel Vindman were also not part of this as well, because remember there was a corollary to this about not getting involved in domestic politics.
Yes, I understand. And you, of course, did you concur with this concern that Mr. Bolton had?
I did, because July 10th is really the first time that it crystallized for me that there was basically a different channel going on here.
And I think you understand.
A policy channel and a domestic policy channel, and we're not in that other channel.
Right. I think you described it as a political errand, and you were doing national security policy is how you distinguish those two channels. Is that fair? Right. And so is it fair to say that you felt it was improper what was occurring by Mr. Sondland in the wardroom?
It was improper and it was inappropriate, and we said that in real time.
And here's my point. If it was improper and you went so far as to report this to the lawyers, what was the nature of your disagreement with Mr. Sondland, who has come here and said he had no idea that Burisma meant Biden's until much, much later than July 10th? And of course, we know that he and Ambassador Volker had a blizzard of interactions with Mr. Giuliani. They were amending statements, proposed statements for the Ukrainian president. This went on all summer. And yet, how is it that you had this disagreement in front of the Ukrainians, sent them out into the hallway? At some point, did he ask, I'm just talking about an investigation of corruption generally. What are you getting so worried about?
He didn't put it in that way, and I think from listening to him in his depositions and in what I've read of what he deposed, and he made it very clear that he was surprised that we had some kind of objection. You may remember that in his deposition and when he was here, he actually didn't remember the meeting in the same way.
But I thought you said it was pretty obvious to you. Excuse me.
Well, it was obvious to me, correct.
I thought it was obvious to you that Burisma meant Biden's.
Yes, it was.
And you actually treated that as a pretty easy thing to understand. In fact, Mr. Morrison figured it out with a single Google search. But is it credible to you that Mr. Sondland was completely in the dark about this all summer? I mean, you had an argument about it. Didn't he say what he's so worried about?
It's not credible to me at all that he was oblivious to this.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your answer.
It is not credible to me that he was oblivious. He did not say Biden's, however, he just said Burisma. He said 2016, and I took it to mean the elections as well as Burisma.
Well, I want to thank you both for your appearance here today. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill and Mr. Holmes, for your service. I have no doubt after today that we're a better nation because of it. We all know by now that in July of this year, President Trump sent an order to the Office of Management and Budget that congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine be put on hold. Both of you have expressed that Ukraine is the first line of defense against Russian aggression and expansion into Europe, that Russia's priority is to undermine the United States. Is that right, Dr. Hill?
That's correct.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Holmes?
Yes.
Dr. Hill, in your professional opinion, is it in the national security interest of the United States to support Ukraine with the much talked about military aid?
Yes.
Mr. Holmes?
Yes.
We've already said it several times today, and you've already testified that Ukraine is in war right now with Russia. Isn't it true, Mr. Holmes, that even though the security assistance was eventually delivered to Ukraine, the fact that it was delayed to a country that is actively in war signaled to Russia that perhaps the bond between Ukraine and the United States was weakening?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And even the appearance that the U.S.-Ukraine bond is shaky could embolden Russia to act in an even more aggressive way.
That's correct.
You also testified that it was, and I quote, the unanimous view of the Ukraine policy community that the aid should be released because supporting Ukraine is in our national security interest. Dr. Hill, why do you believe that the entire Ukraine policy community were unanimously in agreement?
Well, we've had this experience before, and I just want you to indulge me for a moment. In 2008, Russia also attacked the country of Georgia. I was the national intelligence officer at that particular juncture, and we had warned in multiple documents to the highest levels of government that we believed that there was a real risk of a conflict between Georgia and Russia. And in fact, we also believed at that point that Russia might attack Ukraine. This was in 2008 when both Georgia and Ukraine sought a membership action plan in NATO. And Russia threatened them openly that if they proceeded with their request for NATO membership, that there would be consequences. In the wake of the attack on Georgia, President Putin made it clear to the president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili at the time, and this was related to me at the highest levels of the Georgian government, that Putin had said directly to Saakashvili, your Western allies, your Western partners promised a great deal. They didn't deliver. I threatened, I delivered. We had made all kinds of promises to Georgia and Ukraine in that time frame, and we didn't come through. So Putin is always looking out to see if there is any hint that we will not follow through on promises that we have made, because he will always follow through on a threat, as indeed he ultimately did. He threatened Ukraine in 2008, and it wasn't until 2014 when Ukraine tried to conclude an association agreement with the European Union that he struck. But he had been threatening this for the whole period since 2008.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. And Mr. Holmes, what kind of message does it potentially send to other allies of the United States when military holds for assistance or imposed with absolutely no explanation? What kind of message does it send to our allies in terms of the good faith and good relationship with the U.S.?
It calls into question the extent to which they can count on us.
Policies change, but U.S. interests don't, at least not for those true public servants who are committed and dedicated to protecting our nation. Thank you both for being two of them.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming in, and thank you for your service. Dr. Hill, you stated in your deposition you've been accused of being a mole for George Soros in the White House, correct?
That's correct.
You said in your deposition specifically a conspiracy was launched against you by convicted felon Roger Stone on the show InfoWars, led by Alex Jones, right?
I don't think he was a convicted felon at the time that he launched this, so I didn't use those exact words. But it was indeed Roger Stone and Alex Jones on InfoWars in 2017. And in fact, just more recently, before Mr. Stone endured his trial, they were at it again, reprising the same InfoWars video and adding embellishments.
And they said, I'll quote what they said about you. We here at InfoWars, this is Roger Stone speaking, first identified Fiona Hill, the globalist leftist George Soros insider who had infiltrated McMaster's staff. He said that on May 31st, 2017. I presume you're not a globalist leftist Soros insider, correct?
I think my coal mining family would be very surprised to hear all of these things about me.
I'd agree.
Actually, leftist, perhaps not so much, but anyway, the left in Europe is a bit different from the left here, let's put it that way.
I agree. Interestingly, you stated in your deposition that a similar conspiracy theory had actually been launched against Marie Yovanovitch.
That's correct.
And you said specifically, when I saw this happening to Ambassador Yovanovitch, again, I was furious because this is, again, just this whipping up of what is frankly an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about George Soros to basically target nonpartisan career officials. Isn't that what you said?
I did say that, yes.
And I'm sure you've been watching with concern what's happened to other nonpartisan career officials. We had Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman, an American immigrant, questioned for his criticism of the president in a very unfair way, basically questioning his loyalty to the country. I believe that he's also of Ukrainian Jewish descent. Would you say that these different theories, these conspiracy theories that have been targeting you, spun in part by folks like Mr. Stone, as well as fueled by Rudy Giuliani and others, basically have a tinge of anti-Semitism to them at least?
Well, certainly when they involve George Soros, they do. I'd just like to point out that in the early 1900s, the Tsarist secret police produced something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which actually you can still obtain on the internet, and you can buy it actually sometimes in bookshops in Russia and elsewhere. This is the longest running anti-Semitic trope that we have in history. And the trope against Mr. Soros, George Soros, was also created for political purposes. And this is the new Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I'd actually intended to write something about this before I was actually invited to come into the administration because it's an absolute outrage.
I'm sorry you've been kind of wrapped up in these crackpot conspiracy theories. Let me turn to Rudy Giuliani. You became increasingly concerned about Rudy Giuliani's increasing role in Ukraine between January and March of 2019, correct?
That's correct.
And I know you served in the Bush and the Obama administrations. I presume that George Bush's personal lawyer and President Obama's personal lawyers were never, directing or heavily influencing Ukraine policy.
I'm not even sure I know who they were. So the answer is no.
And the concern for having someone like Rudy Giuliani having such a strong influence on American foreign policy is that, basically that policy may be operating not in the best interest of America, but perhaps in the best interest of Rudy Giuliani or his clients or business associates, right?
I think that's correct, and that's, as I said in my deposition on October 14th, that frankly that's what I thought it was at the very beginning when I first heard Mr. Giuliani making these statements.
And some of those associates included indicted folks, Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, isn't that right?
That's correct.
We have an interesting character in Chicago who's now been indicted. His name is Mr. Firtash. And Mr. Firtash has been indicted for federal bribery charges, another associate of Giuliani, right?
I do know Mr. Firtash, that's correct. I know of him from my work, that's correct.
And the question that we're all asking is whether American foreign policy in Ukraine is potentially being run in their interests and not our own.
It certainly appears that it is being used, that there's a subversion of American foreign policy to push these people's personal interests.
Thank you so much.